We've been studying, right now we're going through the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths. So maybe we could just do like a short meditation on the first two aspects of the first Noble Truth, the Noble Truth of suffering. Start by, or it's the first. So when we think about the Noble Truth of suffering, one aspect of that is that it says everything is impermanent. All, or impermanence rather, yeah, impermanence, right? So that what it's getting at is that our both our aggregates, right, so our body and mind, and our environment are impermanent. And actually, so in what we were studying last time is so the and they say that's an antidote to the view of permanence, right? So you might feel if you start to contemplate this, well, I don't have to believe things are permanent. I know things are impermanent. But then you check for yourself, right? Like so when if you see like there's a town, this happens nowadays, right? And all the time, right? There's a neighborhood or a town that's there one day, and then the next, because of a storm or a fire, it's gone. And we feel some shock. Or we have like a friend and they're there, and then suddenly they're dead. And we feel some kind of surprise, right? You might even say, right, oh, were they sick? If somebody says, oh, so and so passed, right? You say, oh, were they sick? I didn't know. Like it's the view of permanence. Or even now, like when like say a whole aspect of your government disappears, you notice how you feel. Maybe that there was a grasping at permanence. So we have this, ordinary beings, unenlightened beings, beings who have not realized the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths, do have a grasping at permanence experientially, right? It's not some intellectual idea. It's actually kind of a habit. First of all, on a gross level, right? Everything that arises due to causes and conditions will end. But as we say, it's a logical thing, right? If products, anything that's a product is impermanent. So if something comes together, it will eventually go apart. If two people meet, they'll eventually part. If the parts of an object like a house or a car come together, they won't stay together forever. And then if we look more deeply, that's because actually, if something is a product of causes and conditions, actually what happens, right? So certain causes and conditions come together at a certain instant that give a certain appearance. And actually, even then we grasp, if we don't analyze carefully, we grasp as though, oh, well, it's like that for a long time and then it changes. But that's not the case, actually. So if we check and analyze it, right, when causes and conditions come together, right, a certain experience or appearance arises. But actually, then the next instant it's causes, right? In other words, that instant is contributing causes to a next instant of appearance. Like if I say, oh, two people met and they came together and they stayed together for a week, parted, you might feel, oh, okay, so like, yeah, there were causes. One person took the train, another took a car, and they met, and they were together for a week, as if that was some constant state. But actually, each millisecond, right, the appearance of two people being together required like countless causes and conditions, right? Heart beating, electrons, electric impulses in their brains, and all kinds of things had to happen for them to have an appearance of being together for a week. So actually, when things arise due to causes and conditions, they don't abide for another instant, right, without change. And that's the nature of every object in my world. It's also the nature of my body and of my mind. They change instant by instant. And I may feel, oh, there's something, I want to rely on something. But actually, even that thought is a product of utter momentary impermanence. And these aggregates, this body and mind, there's nothing permanent. There's nothing that abides even longer than an instant without changing. And no matter how you analyze it, you can see that, right? Whether if you look on a gross level or if you look on a subtler level, right? If you look on a level of cells, right? Oh my goodness, like everything's changing, right? Blood's flowing, and even within the cells, right? Like a given, even within a given, like this, so the blood is flowing through your body, but then even within one of those um, drops of blood, there are countless changes happening each instant. And then, like on an atomic level, what's happening on a subatomic level, there's nothing permanent, nothing that abides even for an instant. And the same with the mind, constantly changing. Every instant, there's like an awareness and an object of awareness. So you might feel sad, or you might feel happy, you might think of this or think of that. It's a constant flow with each moment arising from the previous one through a causal stream. You check for yourself, right? So you look around, right? In my world, in my body, in my mind, is there any, everything you check, right? Is there some exception? Is there, if is there some person who's permanent? Is there a building that doesn't change instant by instant? The earth itself, the planet, the sun, my emotions, my thoughts. So that, everything that arises due to causes and conditions changes instant by instant in a causal flow. And then we're checking one more point here, right? So in that causal flow, in terms of suffering or well-being, right? Happiness, joy, peace, or liberation, say like that which arises from an impure or suffering, a cause that's in the nature of suffering, in other words, a cause that's associated with mental afflictions, will be, if it arises from a cause that's in the nature of suffering, then it itself will be in the nature of suffering. So like if I check my own experience, right, there are all kinds of gross experiences of suffering. This body, this mind, by their very nature, right? And so it's because they're impermanent, they arose due to causes and conditions. And so I can check my own experience. Are the causes, is there any way to assert that my body and my mind personally arose through the causes that are not in the nature of suffering? Well, then I wouldn't suffer. But if I check, actually, so this body is in the nature. First of all, it gets sick, it gets pain. Actually, not just some gross, no, but even actually, if I hold my body still for a while, for longer than I'm used to, then pains will arise. And so just holding my body still, if I lay on one side too long, this body will suffer. So then I turn to the other side. Then if I lay on that side too long, eventually it'll suffer. So then if I get up and walk, that could be a relief. But actually, if I keep walking, eventually my body suffers. So no matter what I do with this body, right, I can have like a temporary relief by changing its position or changing if I don't eat, eventually this body, right, suffers hunger. And if I start eating, but I keep eating, then eventually there'll be suffering of eating if I eat too long. So it's the very nature of this body that it's subject to suffering. Hmm. The same with the mind, right? Sometimes causes bring about sadness or anger or fear. Right? And then actually, if I don't give my mind stimulus, it'll get bored and suffer. If I give my mind too much stimulus, right, it gets overwhelmed and suffers. And without a choice, all kinds of men, right? Even if I want to be patient, I get angry. If I say to myself, "Oh, today I just want to feel completely peaceful," actually, I can't make myself feel totally peaceful for 24 hours, can I? Just by thinking that's what I want. So if we check, right, this mind is impermanent and this body are impermanent for sure. They're impermanent because that's their nature, because they arose due to causes and conditions. And those causes and conditions, we can logically see had to have been in the nature of suffering because my experience is subject to suffering in the nature of suffering. I have no control over that process, actually. Even if I say I don't want to die, I can't force myself. I can't force not to not die, right? No matter what, because I arose due to causes and conditions, I'll die. I don't want to say give rise to craving, yet craving arises. And then I suffer, right? From either, if I'm craving, then either I want something and can't get it, that's a kind of suffering. Or I'm craving and I get it, and then it's disappointing, then that's another kind of suffering. Or I'm craving and I get it, then eventually I get tired of it, that's another kind of suffering. If you keep contemplating like that, right, you're gonna, this is the nature. You check first, you check for yourself, is that the nature of my body and my experience, my world, or not? And if it is, then the question arises, is there a way to be free, to be liberated from that suffering? If I were to eliminate the causal factors that give rise to suffering, since the mind is in the nature of clear light or the mind is in the nature of clear and knowing, is it possible for the mind to arise through a different causal mechanism that's not subject to suffering? but that's liberated. So I'll just there will come. So this is just the beginning of how we give rise to this mind. I'll call it definite emergence, right? So a mind that wishes to definitely emerge from suffering and the causes of suffering. So we contemplate again and again like that. If I could eliminate, destroy, undermine, completely eliminate the aspects of my being that give rise to suffering, then because of impermanence, what would arise through a different causal mechanism would be liberation, a liberated being who's not subject to those kinds of causes and therefore doesn't experience suffering. And then, since we're doing this as motivation, not only am I subject to that, but everyone is subject to that kind of causal mechanism. So actually, real bodhicitta actually is grounded in this awareness, right? May I liberate myself and all beings from that kind of causal mechanism, from being trapped through having the causes of suffering in my stream of being, or our stream of being, right? Then we give rise to to results that are in the nature of suffering. But actually, really, bodhicitta is like that. It's this wish to free oneself and others from the deepest causes of suffering and to lead oneself and all others to a state of liberation from suffering. And then when you analyze it that way, you say, well, who can do that? Well, that's what a Buddha does, right? The Buddha liberates themselves and is, in order to be most skillful at liberating others from the causes of suffering. So may I achieve Buddhahood, the welfare of all beings, in this very deep way, in this way that eliminates suffering and its causes. And actually, I'm going to once recite that verse of refuge and bodhicitta, but try to listen to it in the context of the Four Noble Truths now. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, through the merits of generosity, the other perfections, become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. So I say, so they're like, I hope you start to just begin to get the feeling that there are like, this topic of the Four Noble Truths in general and the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths in particular is something you can, you could would be interesting. I mean, if you think about it, it becomes something interesting to contemplate and meditate on again and again. And that's that's the practice. That's practice. That's part of practice. And so, okay, in the 16 aspects. One point I didn't say last time, I just wanted to mention is so they call it the Four Noble Truths, and noble is Arya, right? Arya truths in Sanskrit. And in the commentaries, they point out, they say, first of all, they're called truths because they're true, they're true insights about the nature of reality. And they're called Arya truths, noble truths, because it's Aryas, it's noble beings who see these truths directly. So in other words, ordinary beings, we contemplate them, right, in order to become. And so, in a sense, they're like, yeah, they're true. They're true for everybody, but ordinary people, so for example, like we grasp at things as though they're permanent, so we don't directly see that things are impermanent, right? That's why we're surprised when something happens, and so the idea here is that they're true regardless. In other words, it's not like, I haven't realized it, so things are permanent. It doesn't happen, does it? Things are impermanent by their very nature, so they're true in that sense. But when you yourself become a noble being, then you see that directly. And before that, we contemplate these truths in order to, that's how you become a noble being, actually, because you become somebody who's realistic. Actually, noble in a sense is realistic being, a being who sees things realistically. And we don't see things realistically. Where actually they say that, right? Where there's no, for example, where there's no self, we see a self. Where things are in the nature of suffering, we see happiness, and so on. So we're confused about these points. So that's one point I just want to mention. So that when we say oftentimes you hear that, the Four Noble Truths, right? And so actually one way of, if you hear that, when you hear the term Four Noble Truths, one point is, oh, that's the truth. Let me check. Let me see if that's true. Let me analyze that, it's part of it. But then if you start to see that they are true, when you think of the word Arya or noble, you might think, well, oh, may I become someone noble, someone who sees reality, may I be able to see them actually more clearly, because I don't yet see, even though I know even if you analyze it logically, you can see they're true, but in some cases, hopefully. But then that's a different point from, may I be able to see them directly? Does that make sense? And that's part of the goal here. See them directly is a good way to put it. And then last time I was pointing out, so that each of the Four Noble Truths has 4 aspects each, right? So there's 16 aspects, 4 times 4. And those aspects help overcome certain wrong views or wrong understandings that we may grasp at, or that in some cases we do grasp at. And so I already went through, right? Like with the first noble truth, I'll just summarize that, right? So with the first noble truth, the truth of suffering, the first was impermanent, right? That things are impermanent, and therefore, and that's connected to our suffering, our experience of suffering. And there's gross impermanence and subtle impermanence. We just went through that, right? Subtle impermanence is momentary change. And you keep checking, right? I mean, and again, there are many ways in which, you could see it. One point I wanted to make too, I was thinking, actually this week, I was thinking about this, that it's kind of funny. You know, I'll just say, actually, this week, one day this week, I was sort of laughing to myself because I thought, well, like I was remembering back, and I was remembering like my gurus, my teachers, my Tibetan Buddhist teachers. In this case, that's what I was thinking of. They would say over and over, right, these points: things are impermanent, things are in the nature of suffering. Things change instant by instant. Nothing lasts. And I thought, like, I started laughing actually at myself, because I was like, wow, they were so kind trying to say it over and over. But then I was like, I'm a kind of dense. So then luckily reality comes along and helps remind me of their teaching, and like, so when I'm dense and don't see the truth of what they're saying, then, so actually the way I thought it was like, oh, if they couldn't push me through the door of seeing it directly, then reality's pushing me through that door. When you see a hurricane destroy or fire destroy LA, right? It pushes you through the door. If your teacher telling you, oh, everything can change in an instant, then you say, oh, that seems true, but then you kind of forget about it, and you don't take it seriously, or you don't, then like when, somebody says, oh, the entire region is completely obliterated, then you say, oh, wow, things are really impermanent. Oh my goodness. Or like, and somebody calls up and says, oh, your friend died, and you go, oh my gosh, really? And then you say, wait, why am I saying really? Like, didn't I know that could happen? And so on, right? And then, and then I was giving the government changes too, right? Everything changes, right? Instant by instant, it's the nature of reality. It's the nature of phenomena, right? And so the same thing with suffering, right? If you don't want to, if you say, oh no, like people are like that, right? So we'll say, oh no, but so they can feel immune to suffering, right? Sometimes through youth or through wealth or through beauty or through something, but actually it doesn't. You're not immune to suffering, right? And so if you don't realize it by listening to the teachings, then you'll, reality will give you second chances and third chances, but you have to pay attention to what reality's demonstrating. And then I wanted to mention a couple other points before we go. Mostly we're going to do the last 2 noble truths because we did the others. But one point I want to make is, these 4 noble truths are taught in the Abhidharma and the Pramana teachings. And one point I wanted to say is, like, also there's a logical process, right? Like that I was hinting at as we were meditating, right? If things are impermanent, right, then that means they're caused, right? And so you can check, right? So there's a way you can analyze these 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths, and you're supposed to do that, right? So are things impermanent? Actually, there's a whole logical thing in Pramana teachings. Are all products of cause and conditions impermanent? if something is produced, does that mean by definition it's permanent? It's impermanent, right? And you check. Actually, anything that's impermanent, anything that's arisen due to cause and conditions is momentary. And then you can check what's the kind of process. What kinds of causes give rise to what kinds of results, right? And then you see suffering, the suffering cause gives rise to a suffering result. A pure cause gives rise to a pure result, pure meaning free from suffering. So you check, right? And then these last two, empty and selfless, I said this before last time. So empty in this context, there are different meanings to the word empty, but in this context, it means empty of a permanent, unitary, independent self. Or another way of saying it is a self that's separate from the aggregates, separable from the aggregates, or that's nature is separate from the aggregates. And then selfless is empty, means there's no self-sufficient, substantially existent self, which means there's no self in the aggregates or associated with the aggregates. And a few points I guess I'll just mention briefly. One is they actually say in the commentary, if you don't realize empty and selfless, then even if you contemplate impermanence and the nature of suffering, still craving will arise. What it says here is craving for mine. Because you grasp at I, a craving for mine will arise, right? So you'll continue to crave for the things of samsara. So you won't be able to get. So at this level, when we're first contemplating, obviously we haven't realized yet selflessness, but we have to contemplate it, because otherwise what will happen is, so if you actually, if you grasp at, and I was saying this last time a little bit, but if you grasp at a self, right, then then you won't be able to help it. You'll grasp at mine, meaning samsaric things, right? Samsaric objects or samsaric senses. And actually, sometimes one of that, and this is what I was saying last time, if you grasp, it could be either grasping at like my senses, right? I want to hear something. I want to see something beautiful. I want to hear something nice. I want tactile sensation. I want food. I want they'll be grasping for mine. And actually, if you grasp at a kind of self separate from the aggregates, then you might grasp for like, those aggregates aren't, if you start to feel like those aggregates are mine because you say you're dying, then you'll grasp, well, I want to go someplace better. I want something better for me, right? And you'll grasp at something that's actually not the right thing to grasp for. So the idea here is that if you don't realize at this point around the certain truth of suffering, if you don't contemplate those two kinds of selflessness, then you'll grasp for mine and you won't actually generate the wish for liberation. Then, and I'm just summarizing, we covered this last time. Then in terms of the true origins, right? The cause of suffering is in this context, there are different ways to put it, right? I said this last time. Craving is mentioned in the text, or you make it broader and say all the mental afflictions, that karma that produces them, right? I'm going back to the causal mechanism here, right? So what it's getting at, the Buddha is saying that which are, things that are impermanent arose from causes, right? So what are the causes of suffering? It's the mental afflictions. They arise from ignorance, actually. So the root cause is ignorance, grasping at self, or grasping at inherent existence. You can say it different ways, but that grasping, and that's what I was getting at a minute ago, right? If you grasp at a self, then you will crave, right, for something. And that's how you cycle in samsara. So that's the cause. And then origin was getting at how it's not just one cause, right? But it's this cycle, right? So in other words, that as long as you keep grasping at a self, you keep craving. And then once you crave, you're also going to have anger or aversion at something else because they're blocking you from having what you want. Then you'll have pride because you think you have more than somebody else, and insecurity because you think you have less than somebody else, and it goes on and on. So there are many causes and conditions, and it becomes a cycle, right? And it's not just one cause. There are various causes that contribute, and it goes on and on as a cycle until you break that wheel, they say. You break that causal mechanism. And then strong production is getting at those things are sufficient, actually. In other words, that is the causal mechanism, that there's not some other being, so nobody else is causing your samsara. And also there's no God that's causing your samsara, right? There's no whatever. There's no primal substance that's causing it. There's another Indian school that thought there was a primal substance that causes your samsara. It wasn't God. And they're saying, no, there's no primal substance. There's nobody else. It's just your own mental afflictions that produce actions. Even I'll change karma to actions, right? Your mental afflictions make you do things. And then what you do leads to something else. It's a causal sequence, right? You're angry and you shout at somebody. Well, that's what we're talking about, right? Then that produces an effect. And then that effect produces another effect. And then that produces another effect. That's what samsara is. And then condition. Condition is saying that happens in this life, and then when you die, that happens again, right? You crave. Because you're grasping at a self, as you're dying, you continue to grasp at a self, you crave for a self, and that activates your causal karmic karma, and then that throws you to continue. So you keep going somewhere to yell at somebody, for them to yell at you. And you can do that from life to life to life, which is what we do in samsara. So that's what that's saying. Anyway, I covered those two truths last time. I just wanted to summarize them. And then we'll pick up with we didn't cover yet the third noble truth, which is the truth of cessation, right? In this text, the four aspects of the truth of cessation. And so remember, I said this last. So each of these four noble truths, there are, and each of the four aspects of the four noble truths overcomes four wrong views. So I want to mention what are the four wrong views related to the truth of cessation or liberation, you could say too. So one is, here's one wrong. So these are the four wrong views that overcome. One is liberation is utterly non-existent. So I'll pause there. Have you ever met anyone who thinks the liberation from suffering is utterly non-existent? Actually, if you live in this culture, most people, that's the view of the vast majority, like actually almost everybody would say that. So there is no such, so one wrong view is that there's no such thing as liberation from suffering, samsara. Another wrong view, actually, I think if you, for the most part, if people I meet don't have this first wrong view, they would have the second one. So the second wrong view is that holding that some afflicted phenomena is liberation, right? So some people may, and also it's not just other people, it's oneself, Whereas I'm saying living in this culture and other people, but if I live in this culture, it's because I have a karmic tendency to have those wrong. Does that make sense? And so we have to check for ourselves, right? So one is, are there moments where you think there's no such thing as liberation, that it's in your nature to have mental afflictions and suffer, right? The second one, holding that some afflicted phenomena is liberation. I'll give an example of what I mean by that. Actually, it happens all the time, right? Somebody might say, oh, well, I'll when I die, I'll go to heaven and I'll be with my friends and family, right? And that'll be liberation. Well, one point is, of course, Buddhism, that's not how it works. But another point, actually, I sometimes laugh at that one because I think, I remember for my mom's 80th, well, this was a year and a half ago. For my mom's 80th birthday, my sister and her family and we rented a house to all go to with my mom and her boyfriend because it was her 80th birthday. And I was like, after a couple of days, people start to get on each other's nerves. So it's like you can't even get through a weekend, long weekend without getting on each other's nerves. All eternity wouldn't work. That wouldn't be liberation. I'm sort of joking, but it's true actually. There is an afflicted phenomena is not liberation. And then the third one is holding that there's some liberation that's superior to the cessation of suffering, right? So it's holding some kind of view that the cessation of suffering, well, that is liberation, but there's something even better than that. And then the fourth wrong view is that there is liberation from suffering, but it's temporary, and then you suffer again. Right? And so these four aspects of the truth of cessation overcome those four wrong views, which again, the point here is not do other people have those, it's at moments do I have those. Does that make sense? And actually, and the truth is, if you actually check for yourself, how much have you thought about the truth of cessation? Whereas in Buddhism, that's the goal, right? Whether you're trying to achieve your own liberation or Buddhahood. Actually, if you're practicing like the path, the Buddhist path, all the paths in Buddhism lead to some kind of cessation, right? So it's just interesting. How much time have you spent thinking about cessation? If that's the goal, if you're practicing Buddhism, it's kind of funny, right? Do you think about that much? Well, here you would, right? If you're meditating on the Four Noble Truths, you think about it. So a couple more points I'll make. Another one is and also sometimes the truth of cessation is called the result of the fourth noble truth, the result of the truth of the path, right? So you contemplate it. That's another way to think about what it is. It's the result of the path. We haven't yet contemplated the path because, again, I said this last time too, from a causal sequence, the path comes first and then cessation. But from a realization perspective, that's what the order of the Four Noble Truths that the Buddha taught in Sarnath when he first taught, was the order in which one realizes it. So in other words, you have to first realize there is such a thing as cessation, then you follow the path, and then you achieve cessation. Right? You won't follow the path if you don't know there is such a thing, and that it's worthwhile. So that's why it's presented in the order in which we have to think about it. And then another thing is, okay, so each of these Four Noble Truths has a basis. Like the basis of the first Noble Truth was the Four Noble Truth of suffering was your own aggregates, right? Whereas that's what you're thinking about, my aggregates, right? They're in the nature of suffering. And then when it came to the truth of the origins of suffering, the basis was karmic formations, craving, the mental afflictions. So here, what's the basis? The basis is the permanent extinction of the delusions and sufferings by means of an antidote. So that's what we're thinking about. The permanent cessation or extinction of the mental afflictions and of the suffering that they result in by means of an antidote. And there's something worth just noting here, which is that the other three noble truths are impermanent phenomena. But this one actually is in Buddhism, we call it a permanent phenomenon. And what does that mean, actually? It means a cessation is a mere absence. Right? So in other words, it's the mere absence of the causes of suffering that leads to the mere absence of the result, suffering. Right? So when we say permanent, one point is actually in this case it does mean it doesn't change back. Right? But another meaning of that is it's not something that arises instant by instant, because an absence is not like that. Right? If I say there are no dinosaurs in this room, that's not an impermanent. That didn't arise due to cause and conditions, and it's not an impermanent phenomenon because it's a mere absence. There aren't any here. So it's a mere absence. So in this case, the truth of cessation is a mere absence of mental afflictions, which are the cause of suffering and of their resultant suffering. So that's the nature of cessations. But then, and now I'll go through the four aspects of the truth of cessation. So the first aspect of the truth of cessation is cessation, which means that cessation is so it means there is such a thing as cessation, that the cause of cessation can be eliminated, and therefore the result can be eliminated as well, suffering. And here, what one contemplates, right, if one's going to contemplate this, is that what one contemplates, actually, it's only Dalai Lama says something about this. He says, actually, when you're going to contemplate cessation, you have to think, because you haven't yet realized cessation, right? You're not when you're first contemplating this, you haven't realized it directly. When you're an Arya, you've realized a cessation, actually, certain cessations. But ordinary beings like us, we don't yet have any cessation. So how do you think about that? So he says, first you have to think, you have to analyze, what is the nature of awareness or mind? And so the nature of mind is, sometimes they say clear light, or they say it's actually clear and knowing. It's really a simple way to put it. So the nature of my mind is clear in the sense that it's not physical, it doesn't have any obstruction, and its nature is to be aware, and it's aware of whatever any object. It can be aware of any object. It's not like you can be aware of some things and not others. The nature of awareness is such that it can be aware of anything. And so if that's the nature of awareness, then one point is that's not an afflicted phenomena. That's not its very nature afflicted. Does that make sense? And it means that the mental afflictions are not intrinsic to mind, that they're what we call adventitious, which means they arise due to causes and conditions, right? And so you check, like, so actually, even like if you check for yourself, well, am I always, I sometimes laugh when I think about this, am I always, you might say, oh, a lot of times I'll have desire for something, right? But you say, am I always desirous? You have to say no, actually, if you check your own experience. Like, for example, sometimes if you're extremely angry, you don't want anything, right? You're so mad, like somebody could offer you your favorite whatever, and you'd say, leave me alone, right? Oh, so then desire is not intrinsic to my mind because sometimes I'm so angry that I can't have any desire, and then like sometimes you might feel pride, right? Arrogance or something, or sometimes you might feel insecurity, or sometimes you might feel, and so on, all these different mental afflictions, but you don't feel any of them all the time, right? That's my point. So therefore they arise due to causes and conditions. Right? And then if you check, whichever ones I'm most familiar with are the ones that arise most, actually, right? Like, so in other words, if I go through a period of time, let's say, where I'm particularly, well, actually, like, let's say somebody is going through a period of time where they're like addicted to something, right? Then like thoughts of craving will be more and more and more, right? But then if somebody recovers from that, then if slowly that kind of affliction can decrease and they can replace it with some other affliction, something like that. Sometimes, so that a different affliction is more prominent. So they're arising due to causes and conditions, what you're exposed to, who you're around, what you're habituating your mind to, what you're, and so you start to contemplate, and we can, I'm being a little, I'm only emphasizing the afflictions here because that's our experience oftentimes, right? But you go, okay, even though I always have seen some mental afflictions, not always, but so much of the time, they do arise due to causes and conditions. They do change. And sometimes, like a certain affliction temporarily stops, right? Like there are times where like I'm totally not angry at all. Right? And there are times where I feel totally content. There's nothing I want. I feel like, just content and at peace, right? I'm not craving for anything. And there are times where I don't feel insecure. I just feel calm. Like I'm not worrying about something. And so you can go, wow. So like they can temporarily stop and they arise due to causes, right? And most of those causes are certain conditions, but the main cause is habituation. So they're not in the nature of my mind. If they were in the nature of my mind, they would always be there, right? But they change, and they're adventitious in the sense that they arise due to causes and conditions. So if I were to decrease those causes, and that's part of the reason why in Buddhism you often go do a retreat, right? Like sometimes you go to do a retreat to go, wow, what would it like? Can I experience something where there's like a lesson? Because actually, retreat doesn't mean going someplace quiet. We say that like, oh, I'm going to go to a retreat center. But actually, retreat really means having fewer mental afflictions. Actually, if you go somewhere and you have just as many mental afflictions, it's not a retreat, according to Buddhism. So the idea is like, well, if you do a retreat, it's to have some experience. And His Holiness points this out. He says, if you start to experience periods where there are fewer mental afflictions, then you start to go, oh, wow. You start to have more faith, more trust, more understanding. Oh, they really are. Because you're not going to believe it if you're always angry, for example, you're not going to go, oh yeah, but it's possible to have cessation, right? But if you start to get more patient, right, then you go, oh wow, it's possible. If I continue that, His Holiness pointed out, he said, you start to have some kind of recognition. If I continue this process, it'll keep getting less. And eventually it could stop. And then if you understand how self-grasping gives rise to the mental afflictions, you realize, oh, if I undermine that, then the mental afflictions will stop. Then you start to see, oh, wow, okay, so cessation is possible. Does that make sense? That's the contemplation here. So you start to go, oh, wow, it is possible. And that is the antidote to the view that liberation is not possible, which again, on the one hand, I said it, right? If I actually took a survey of people I come across in the day, do you believe, if I start walking around, it'd be funny, right? Excuse me, do you believe that liberation from all suffering is possible and all of its causes? Well, people just look at you like you're crazy, but they surprised say no. Um, but the point is like, do I believe that? Right? How deeply do I believe it? And do I believe my mental afflictions are separable or adventitious or separable from my mind? Well, you have to check, right? You analyze it. And this analysis is not just it's intellectual, but it's also experiential. You go, like, well, can I decrease them? How much can I decrease one? You work on one mental affliction. You see, how much can I decrease it? And if you see, wow, I can decrease it quite a bit, that gives you more trust. It's possible. And what they say actually is that the further you get on the path, the more clear you are the cessation is possible because you start to have more experience of it. Right? And then when you achieve the path of seeing, you actually achieve certain cessations, and then experientially for certain. Oh, wow, cessation is possible because I've experienced directly now. And then you can see, oh, so the other cessations will be possible because I already have these cessations. And I see how it came about through realizing emptiness. So if I realize emptiness more deeply or repeatedly, it will eliminate more and more, like a washing machine, cleaning out layers and layers of dirt. So the next one of these four aspects is peace or pacification. Um, and so a few points here. One is that this is the antidote to the view that some afflicted phenomena is liberation, like heaven or something like that, or some other realm, or some, in other words, part of this point is that peace or nirvana is not a place. So there's no place you can go that's nirvana, right? There's no place on this planet, and there's no place on another planet that's nirvana. Nirvana is a state of being, and so peace means here that that if you actually contemplate this way, that if you completely eliminate the causes of something, that thing cannot arise. That's the point, right? So in other words, that if you completely destroy the causes for a certain thing, then that certain thing will not happen. And so then the contemplation here is, what is peace, right? We say, oh, I want peace, or I want peace in the world, or I want inner peace, or I want. Here, what they're getting at is peace means that when you understood the cause of suffering, now that you understand that the nature of mind is clear and knowing, the mental afflictions are separable. So here the contemplation is, so if I completely eliminate, if I completely eliminate self-grasping, right? Grasping at an I, then I won't grasp at a mind. If I don't grasp at mine, then I won't think I'm better or worse than somebody else. And I won't be angry at somebody else for blocking me from having what I want. And so the mental afflictions will stop through wisdom understanding emptiness of self, right? That there's no intrinsically existent self. Yeah, so you get it. If I destroyed that mental affliction or that ignorance, which according to the Prasangika view is a kind of mental affliction. Some schools don't call it mental affliction. Prasangikas do. But if I eliminate that kind of self-grasping, I won't grasp at mine, I won't grasp at other, and then all those other mental afflictions, like whether it's insecurity or craving or anger, will stop. And then that is nirvana. That is peace. Um, and so you contemplate like that. And that overcomes the view that some other thing is peace. Right? Then sublimity, that's what they call it here, being sublime. That's that there's no freedom or liberation higher than that. In other words, so that if you can eliminate your mental afflictions, actually it's a logical analysis. That's what freedom is, actually. Then you're free from samsara, right? You're free from the causal mechanism of suffering. And there is no higher freedom than that. Um, and if you think of it in terms of, because actually, yeah, like actually I was contemplating this way, like, I'll ask a question. An arhat has achieved that, right? So somebody who's achieved their own personal liberation has achieved that. But a Buddha achieves a higher state than an arhat. Right? Buddhahood is higher than arhat. So has the Buddha achieved a higher liberation? And what this point of sublimity is getting at is a Buddha has achieved a higher ability to help others. The Buddha is more able to help others, but they're equally free. Or is the Buddha is free from suffering, the Arhat's free from suffering. Um, Arhats don't suffer. An eighth Bhumi Bodhisattva, according to the Prasangika view, is free from all the mental afflictions. The Buddha is not more free from the mental afflictions than them, but the Buddha has more ability to help others than them. So that's the difference. Does that make sense? So there isn't a more sublime freedom than the elimination of the cause of suffering, which eliminates suffering. And then the last one is called definite emergence here, or Art Engel translates deliverance. You can translate different ways, but the point here is that that kind of liberation or that kind of cessation is not temporary. Because you've completely eliminated the deepest cause of the thing, it won't come back. And the point here is there are temporary liberations, actually, or there are temporary suppressions of the mental afflictions, but this is not getting at that. This is getting at you have to eliminate the actual deepest cause, right, which is ignorance. And then you'll eliminate the mental afflictions. So if you actually eliminate the deepest cause of the mental afflictions, then they won't arise again. And so again, you contemplate that. But it's not a temporary state. And that's the antidote to that view, that it's a temporary kind of break. And so again, though, with these 4 points, the idea is that if, again, what I'm getting at earlier, right, if you're actually trying to practice a Buddhist path, then the goal is cessation, right? Or part of the goal, at least, is cessation. So the idea would be that actually, if you haven't contemplated these kind of points, then actually that I would argue, and this is what this is saying, is that actually you won't give rise to renunciation or to definite. You won't give rise to the genuine wish for liberation, because you actually haven't thought much about what liberation is. Does that make sense? So what this is saying is, if you really want to practice the path, then you contemplate these points in order to, first of all, check for yourself if they're true, if they make sense to you, if they're reasonable, if they actually not just reasonable, but you can actually have what they say in the Pramana teachings. They say you can have a pramana, like a valid cognition of these points. And if you have that, then it develops a conviction for your practice that you want to achieve such a state of liberation. And if you don't, then you'll sort of say, oh, that's interesting. Like actually there are a lot of, we can do that, right? We say, oh, that's, that like, if you don't contemplate this, then you might say somehow like, oh, well, I really like something about Buddhism and I'll do the part I like, but I'm not really seeking liberation. You don't really seek it because you don't actually haven't thought about it much. It's not something, because actually we all seek what we think about, right? Like we seek what we think has some value. So here you actually contemplate, is there a kind of freedom higher than cessation? Or is cessation, is it permanent or is it impermanent? So you keep contemplating until you go, wow, if it really is that, then actually what else would I want? If I want something and this is actually here, it's for myself, right? Later you think about it for others, but here you're saying, if I want something for myself, what else would I want if that's the truth? If that's not true, then forget it. If that is true, right, then why am I seeking something else, actually, that actually won't eliminate my suffering, right? Like, and you can check for yourself, right? Like, so you might say, well, first I have to get something else in order, and then I'll seek liberation, right? But whatever you're putting in order, actually, it's funny. If it's in the nature of samsaric suffering, right? If it's the nature of impermanence, actually, you can't put that in order. And if you put it in order, it's going to fall apart, right? And it's not reliable, actually. Like actually, that's what it's getting at. It's not reliable, actually, if that's true. And you check for yourself, right? But you check that, right? Like, oh, like you may think, oh, well, yeah, I want to do some practice to realize cessation. First of all, I don't think that at all. But if you do, then you might think, oh, but first I need to do X, right? But check, why do I need to do X? What will X give me? Like, can I rely on that X will give me something? Um, yeah, then you get the point. Um, And then the idea is that if you contemplate that and you start to think, I really want to achieve that kind of cessation, liberation, freedom. We often talk about freedom, right? This is Buddha's view of freedom is this, right? This is what freedom would be. So then you think, what's the path to that? Does that make sense? So that's where the question arises: what's the path to that freedom? And so that's the last one, which is the four aspects of the truth of the path, right? And I'll go through the same thing. So the basis, right? In this case, the others I went through, what's the basis? Here, the basis is the exalted wisdom directly realizing selflessness, which is just nice to even hear the word, right? Like the exalted wisdom directly realizing selflessness. So that's the path. Actually, that's the basis of the path. That's the main point of the path. I said earlier, right? The cessations are called the result of the truth, the result of the path, right? So the point is that kind of exalted wisdom directly realizing the truth of selflessness is the antidote. Does that make sense? That's the direct antidote. And it's only this, actually, it's only Dalai Lama says this, but also the prominent teachings say this, that there are things that are temporary antidotes, or that can suppress or can distract you. Actually, some therapists say, somebody's like, well, actually, it's true, isn't it? Like, if you're really angry, even if you go watch a comedy, it distracts you. At least maybe you're distracted, so you're less angry. That's not an antidote to anger. It's a distraction. It works. I mean, it does decrease anger, right? Like, but it's not the ultimate antidote, right? So here it's a direct antidote. And what does that mean, actually? I'm going to say a point is, if you have a wrong understanding of something and you distract from it, but you still have that wrong understanding, but at least you're not focusing on it, so it's not causing immediate mental afflictions, right? But a direct antidote is something that when you see it, it directly contradicts that wrong understanding. Does that make sense? And the wrong understanding cannot abide together with this new understanding. Just to give like a very simplistic example, like, oh, actually, it's funny. Okay, like, I'm giving a silly example here, but it's just true. Actually, like yesterday, it happened. Shayla, who thought that I had put her vase somewhere else. She was like, "Where's my vase? I can't find it. Where'd you put it?" And then she went and looked, and she found, she had put it somewhere. She realized where she put it, and then as soon as she saw it in the place where she had put it, she was like, "Oh, you couldn't have." It was a direct contradiction. Does that make sense? There was no way she could think, "Oh, you put it somewhere," because she saw where she had put it. I'm just giving a silly, simplistic example, right? Once you see it, then you know, and there's no way to hold the other view simultaneously. Here, when you is a much deeper one, right? When you see the exalted wisdom directly realizing selflessness, you can't hold to it self-grasping. The mind of self-grasping is a direct antidote that destroys or eliminates, because you see that it's not true directly. Does that make sense? And when you directly see that something's not true, you can't hold it to be true. And therefore, it's a direct antidote to the self-grasping, and which is the first of the links that gives rise to the other mental afflictions, which then gives rise to karma. So it undermines the whole and destroys the entire process. And then the four wrong views to be overcome. For this truth, the first one is that the path to liberation is utterly non-existent. And I want to point out, like, first of all, many people think that, right? There is no path to liberation. But then also, like, I've had this one. Myself, I've sometimes, when I meditate on this one, I think, oh, of course there's a path to liberation. But then if I check, do I believe there's a path to liberation for me? Then there are moments where I'm like, well, I'm not so sure. Then you have to check. Well, why? Is your mind not in the nature of clear and knowing? Do you have some kind of mental affliction that's permanent and in the nature of your mind? And you have to check. You see what I'm getting at? Like, you have to check. So one wrong view is, anyway, that's the first wrong view, though, that the path to liberation. And you have to have the idea here is you have to understand that the path to liberation is possible for all beings, including yourself and all others. Second wrong view is holding that the wisdom directly realizing selflessness is not the path. So if you think some other thing is the path, and again, it might be like some kind of You know, there are all kinds of people. I'm sure, right? There in India, there were ancient schools that asserted, you know, like self-mortification is the path, or all kinds of other things were the path. But actually, even in Buddhism, you could have the wrong view. Like you could think, oh, the main practice is reciting mantras, right? Or the main practice is making water bowl offerings, or the main practice is, you know, and that's where, like, right, that famous story of Dromdompa, who was Atisha's main disciple, right, where some guy was like he was doing prostrations and he was meditating, he was doing all these different things, right, in Dromdompa. Each time in Dromdompa, his teacher would see him, he would say, "That's nice that you're meditating, but it'd be better if you practice Dharma." "Oh, that's nice you're doing prostrations, it'd be better if you practice Dharma." "Oh, that's nice you're offering water bowls, it'd be better if you practice Dharma." Oh, that, and finally, you know, the guy said, "What does it mean to practice Dharma?" And he said, "Give up on this life in your mind." And in the end, it's give up on self-grasping in your mind, right? And so even if you're practicing Buddhism, you know, so that's why, like they say, if you're going to recite mantras, do it with awareness of emptiness. If you're going to do water bowls, offer them with awareness of emptiness. If you're going to prostrate with awareness of, then it's, you know, then for sure it's a Dharma practice, right? But there is no other path to liberation that doesn't include the wisdom directly realizing selflessness. Another wrong view is that the wisdom realizing selflessness wrongly engages or is a misapprehension. If you have that view, then you're not going to ever pursue the path to the wisdom realizing selflessness. So you have to actually analyze and check, is the wisdom realizing selflessness true, actually? Um, and then the last one is holding that the wisdom realizing selflessness is not capable of permanently extinguishing suffering and its causes. So you see how you have to analyze all these points and see, is the wisdom realizing selflessness the antidote in those ways? And does it do those things? And so of the four, now I'll just quickly go through the four aspects of the truth of the path. And the first of those is called path. And the point here is that it's called a path because it's a means of progressing to liberation. So it's, you know, it's not a physical path, obviously, it's a mind. And actually, this is important. I've said this before, but it's an important point, is that when we say path in Buddhism, paths are always minds. That makes sense? And yeah, so paths are always minds. And in this case, it's a, no, in this case, this contemplation that it is a path is the antidote to the view that there is no true path to true liberation, right? So you check and you analyze. In other words, why would that, you check for yourself, why would the path of the wisdom directly realizing selflessness lead to liberation? Is that true that it leads to liberation? And so on. And the point is that it's a path that leads somewhere. Where does it lead to? Liberation. And you contemplate, why is that the path? Why isn't something else the path? Then the next one is called suitability, or another translator called it rightness. And it means that, and it was what I was saying earlier. So what this point is that it's suitable, or it's the right thing. And so you analyze like this. So they're getting at a few points here. One is the knowledge, something that's untrue can't be the path to liberation. So one point is it true? And then it must be suitable to be an antidote to the cause. Does that make sense? So suitability means you have to understand what you go back. What was the cause of suffering? And is this suitable to, like, you know, I was saying earlier, like you have to, when you directly see a certain thing, then it's the antidote. You know, if it directly contradicts. So in other words, is this just a distraction? Is this just something like meditative concentration suppresses our mental afflictions? If you're in a meditative state and you deeply meditate, your mental, actually, people, if you just do, like, if you go do a breathing meditation, right, your mental afflictions will eventually decrease. And that's good. That's a good thing. But that's not a direct antidote. Does that make sense? That doesn't directly contradict the mode of apprehension. You know, so like, for example, if I think this person's bad, right, that's the mode of apprehension of anger. This person's bad and I hate them, right, and I want to destroy them. the mode of apprehension is intrinsic badness, right? Some kind of inherently existent or intrinsic badness. If I then go meditate on my breath, it'll calm me down. That's good. But it doesn't directly contradict that. When I come out of that breathing meditation, I may come back and go, yeah, but they are bad, and I want to go, whatever. So suitability means, does this directly contradict the mode of apprehension, the mode of seeing that gives rise to suffering, or not? And you have to check. And part of this is you checking your own experience. I gave it, anger is a simplistic example. Self-grasping is subtler, right? And then you check, what's the mode of apprehension of self-grasping, and what would be the mode of apprehension that directly contradicts that, and therefore serves as an antidote to suffering and its causes. And then the third one is achievement, which is there are two different, I'll read two different quotes that I wrote down. It's just, there are two different takes on this one. One is, it leads to a definite achievement of liberation, or the other is, it achieves a non-mistaken view of the nature of your own mind. And you might see, well, those are two different things, but of course, there are two things to contemplate. But the idea here is that if you achieve a direct understanding of the nature of your own mind, that will definitely allow you to achieve liberation. Which is the antidote to the idea that that the wisdom directly realizing selflessness wrongly engages its motive, its object, right? So in other words, what you're getting at here is that you're achieving an actual correct understanding, that selflessness is correct. And I want to explain that more in a few minutes. I'm going to continue on because I want to come back to that, because I want to get at a debate point here. I want to come back to that and debate something together. But so I'm not going to dwell on that one now, because I want to come back to it in a minute. But the last one is deliverance. And deliverance is that this kind of wisdom delivers one without doubt to everlasting liberation. So that the liberation is not something temporary, that is a permanent state of liberation, is the contemplation. And yeah, good, we have time. Because I want to get at something now, because this is actually a point, and I was looking in Chandrakirti. I was actually looking at Lama Tsongkhapa's Illuminating the Intent, which is his commentary to Chandrakirti's Entering the Middle Way, the Majjhimaka Avatara. This is the Prasangika stance, his issues. And he raises some interesting points that I want to sort of put out there, just to think about together. I think it's interesting, I guess, but also it's relevant here. Is he says, in the presentation done, Lama Tsongkhapa says this in his explanation using Chandrakirti.
What page?
Oh, sorry. It's a section around page 82. There are a few pages there, but it's around that area. So Lama Tsongkhapa makes a point following Chandrakirti where he says, in the presentation, in the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths, right, that we're studying, he says what's being gotten at is the empty lack, that selflessness, that there is no self-sufficient, substantially existent self, right? Which means there's no self in the aggregates or on the aggregates or related to the aggregates, right? Which is our innate view. We innately grasp at a self in our aggregates, right? We do. And at a certain point, you contemplate, and it's a common right? If you meditate on emptiness, it's a contemplation, right? Where you identify that kind of self-grasping, right? Self-grasping at and it's there, that experience of self-grasping is there for all of us, right? Where you have this grasping at a self that's here somehow, you feel it's here, right? And oftentimes they'll say that, like, think of being insulted, or think of somebody accusing you of something, or think of somebody, and a feeling of self arises, right? Here somehow, it's you can feel it in your being. And then you analyze, right? Is that self, if it exists, it has to be, logically, it has to either be one with if it exists truly, it has to either be one with the aggregates or different than the aggregates. And then you check. If you've been at teachings by Geshes, right? You do the whole thing. Is it one with the aggregates? And you check around. Is it in my arm? I feel it here. Is it my left ventricle or my right ventricle? Well, the surgeon does, no, place your ventricle. It doesn't, is it in my breastbone? No, it's just a bone. You can replace that, you take it out, it can be broken, and so on, right? But then is it in my feelings, or is it in my happiness or my sadness? Is it in my, different, is it in my anger? You could check all your different mental afflictions, you could check and is it in one moment of consciousness? And you say, no, it's not. And it's not one with the aggregates. But then is it ever seen separate from the body? No, you never say, oh, myself, well, if you say, like, I was in Washington, D.C., say, oh, but myself was in uh, Paris. When I was in Washington, myself was not, right? It's not separate. Separable means it's actually somewhere else, right? And you see it separate from the aggregates. Anyway, so you do this analysis, and then you realize there is no self-sufficient substantially existent self. It doesn't exist, right? And if you realize that, that's the realization that in non-Prasangika schools is called subtle selflessness, right? But then what Lama Tsongkhapa is getting at is, according to the Prasangika school, that's gross level of self. There's a subtler thing. So he raises an interesting question, which he says, so is realizing the lack of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self, does that actually liberate you from samsara? And what Lama Tsongkhapa says is, well, if actually, he basically says, according to the Abhidharma system, so like the Svatantrikas would say yes. Actually, all Buddhist schools other than Chandrakirti's would say yes. But Chandrakirti says, no, that doesn't liberate you from samsara. And Lama Tsongkhapa says, Chandrakirti is right, it doesn't. And he says, it's a very profound realization. And if you realize it, you actually won't have mental afflictions temporarily. But you'll still be grasping at something. And Nagarjuna famously said, I can't remember the exact wording, but he famously said, as long as you're grasping at something, you'll grasp at a self. And then, self-grasping will return. And so he says, Chandrakirti's position is that you have to realize something subtler, which is the emptiness of inherent existence or intrinsic existence. Which isn't mentioned, directly in the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths, because they're presented from, they're not being presented from a Prasangika perspective here. So then I just want to mention some. So for one point is, when you meditate on, so the question I want to raise is, like, in some Buddhist schools, if you're just doing a very simplistic way, we'll say, well, the cause of suffering is craving. Right? But actually, you could temporarily suppress craving, and that's good, but it won't liberate you from samsara, right? So, well, I guess what I'm getting is a few points. One is, it takes a lot of thought and analysis to what's this point about what's the causal mechanism. What's really being gotten at, that all these Buddhist masters are getting at, is, okay, things are impermanent. That's obvious. Impermanence, and that the impermanence of these aggregates came through impure or causes in the nature of suffering, and therefore my experience of suffering. That is pretty obvious too, isn't it? Like, if you check, nobody's going to disprove to you. You check your own experience. Do you suffer or not? And do you suffer instant by instant? Even as you're listening to this talk, this discussion, how many times have you had to shift your body? Right? Like, whatever. I'm just giving small examples, right? So those points you can contemplate pretty easily and see the truth of. But then when you get to what's the deepest cause of suffering, right? That takes a lot of careful thought and analysis, because, you could say craving is the cause of suffering, and it is a cause of suffering. It's true, right? But what causes craving, right? The same, self-grasping. So then Buddhists all agree on that. Self-grasping causes craving. All the Buddhist schools agree on that. But then when you say, well, what is the self-grasping to be gotten rid of? That, what is that actually? That's the deepest cause. That's where there are many different ideas and Buddhist schools of philosophy. And in this context, I want to make 2 points. One is that's something, if you really want to practice the Dharma, that you have to think about a lot for yourself. Does that make sense? And check. And you have to compare it not just intellectually, you have to be intellectual, but you also have to check it in relation to your own experience. And I think I said this before, but I think I mentioned it briefly, but I was just reading this wonderful book by a friend of mine, a couple actually friends who where they compiled like experiential. They were compiling the experiences shared by His Holiness the Dalai Lama of his own practice, certain visions, but also the longest section was on his experience around emptiness. And even the Dalai Lama was describing how when he got really interested in emptiness, he was thinking about it so much. And I noticed as I read it, he didn't say this, but I noticed as I read it that the idea of a independent, self-sufficient, of an independent, permanent, substantial, independent, permanent. What's the third one? Forgetting it at the moment. Robin, you know it.
Self-sufficient.
Self-sufficient. That's independent.
Yeah.
Self-sufficient. That Someone didn't really address that one. I don't think that was an obstacle for him. But there came a point where he was doing that kind of meditation, about the self associated with the aggregates, and he had some kind of realization of selflessness, But then this is the part, and he said it was like being struck by lightning. This whole, he changed his experience of himself and of other people. But this is the part that I love about one of the parts I love about the Dalai Lama is then he looked and he said, "Is that gross or subtle?" I just had this amazing experience, right? Life-changing experience. It changed how I experience everything in my life. And he thought about it, and he said, "Well, when I have that, he could go back to it." And he said, "When I have that realization, there's still some appearance to me of a mind, of an aggregate, right? That's the basis of the self. And that mind is totally absorbed in this realization of selflessness, but there's still some subtle sense of a mind, aggregates, that's a basis, right? And there's no self in that basis. Does that make sense? So he was realizing there's no self in the basis, but there's still a sense of a basis there. And they said, "Oh, that's gross. That's not subtle." And then he went to his teacher and checked, and they said, "Oh yeah, you're right. That's gross. That you've realized this emptiness of a self-sufficient, substantial, existent self. That's very profound." And then his Holiness said, "That was good," and he meditated on it more. But he was like, "Now, how do I realize the lack of it? How do I realize the emptiness of inherent existence?" And my point in sharing that is just like, even His Holiness the Dalai Lama had to check, right, and say, is that the deepest? He's getting at this point. He's getting at the 16 aspects of the Four Truths in a way. Is that the deepest cause? If it's not a good enough, right? Because the mental afflictions will come back. If I'm still grasping at, if there's still some subtle sense of the basis, as if that actually still exists, then eventually there will become a sense of a self associated with that basis. And so how do you understand that the basis itself, mind, even in this case, is empty? And then His Holiness eventually realizes, he describes how, actually, he describes how he had the famous verse from the Chakrasamvara Tantra. I think His Holiness actually described that, so I'll share because it's described publicly. But there's a famous verse from the Chakrasamvara practice, and I think His Holiness had a dream. I think it was of some Dakinis, I think, who were singing that verse, and the verse starts with the emptiness of mind, and then he woke up and thought about that verse, and he realized that the mind is empty, of inherent existence. Although the mind is the cause of everything, there's no intrinsically existing cause, something like that. It's the meaning of the verse, it's not the actual line.
The Sri Haruka.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. Hey stands for the mind, which is the cause of everything, although no inherently existent cause can be found, something like that. So it was the one for hey. And then he realized, Ru is the selfness of persons. But he realized if you realize the emptiness of mind, then you can't grasp at a self of persons, because that arises through grasping at mind. So it's a different sequence, was what his realization was. And he realized that that was the prasangika view realization. Anyway, I mean, this is not the main point here, but one point I wanted to make, though, is if you're going to contemplate these, it's the one really important thing is to contemplate what is the cause of suffering, right? And what is the direct antidote to it? And how does that function to eliminate the mental afflictions, and so on. So these are things to think about, and then if you think about them, that's how you get a kind of conviction, right? If you agree with them, that that liberation is possible, which then allows you to seek it, if that makes sense. And there was one other point I want to make. Oh, the point to make is, okay, so then in the, actually the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths, though, are taught in many contexts. In the Abhisamayalankara, which we're studying, they're taught in the Abhidharma, they're taught in the Pramana teachings. But in the Abhisamayalankara, they're taught in accordance with how they're presented in the Prajnaparamita, right, in the Perfection of Wisdom. So I want to go back to what it says in our text that I've been using, which I haven't been reading what the actual text says, because it says, under impermanent, the actual line here in the text I'm looking at, it's on page 50. It says impermanent is indicated. It says impermanent. This is indicated by non-existence in the Prajnaparamita Sutra, in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra. And then suffering. This is indicated by not produced. Right. So in other words, what I'm getting at here is this: is in the Abhidharma, the way this is taught. This is what I'm bringing back now. Why did I mention the Prasangika view when this text is not from the Prasangika perspective, which seems a little strange. Maybe I did that, but in the Abhidharma, right, where it's taught, and the Pramana teachings, it's simply taught that you contemplate the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths, because they help you generate the path. First of all, the wish to follow the path, and then they help you generate the path. And according to their school, when you realize the path of seeing, you directly see the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths. You directly understand them. You directly see them. According to the Prajnaparamita, you do the same thing. You think about the 16 aspects of the Noble Truths when you're on the path of accumulation. You think a lot about the 16 aspects of the Noble Truths, and when you're on the path of seeing, you do realize them directly. But according to the Prajnaparamita, you realize the emptiness of the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths. So you don't just realize them, but you realize that they're empty of inherent existence. So things are not. So actually, and it's an interesting point, like, because according to Prajnapar, I'm going to give an example. Impermanence is true, right? In other words, it's undoubtedly true, right? Things change instant by instant. But we grasp at that as though it's inherently existent. We say, and actually, if you check your own experience, even when I say impermanent, right? So you think, oh, wow, that exists inherently, and then it changes, and then it exists inherently, and then it changes. And there's some kind of inherently existent things that are causally related. But actually, when you think about that as a beginner, we're supposed to think that way. In other words, we're supposed to just think things are impermanent. They really do change instant by instant because we have a view of permanence. But according to the Prajnaparamita, you have to not just realize impermanence, but you have to realize that impermanence itself is empty of inherent existence, because the things that are impermanent are also empty of inherent existence. And actually, impermanence only exists dependent upon impermanent phenomena, and impermanent phenomena exist dependent upon their impermanence, and they're mutually, so you have this understanding that things lack any intrinsic nature, and that's how they are. That they only exist conventionally. That one way of saying it is that impermanence is a conventional truth, right? And its ultimate nature is emptiness. So in the Prajnaparamita, actually, you realize, first, as beginners, we're supposed to think about the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths. Eventually, you also have to think that the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths, you have to understand, actually, that they're also empty of an intrinsic existence. And since we're studying the Abhisamayalankara, that's an important point, is that even the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths are empty of inherent existence. Even cessation is empty of inherent existence, right? It's permanent, but actually, and Chandrakirti says, we say, we say, in this, when I was presenting it, we said, what, empty, the cessations are, how did I say it? The mere, oh, there it is, the permanent extinction of the delusions and suffering by means of their antidote. And Chandrakirti says, he actually refers to the cessations as the emptiness of the permanent extinction and the delusions and their and suffering and their antidotes. So anyway, the point is that even the Four Noble Truths are empty of inherent existence, which is how you can achieve them, actually, because they function. Anyway, that's maybe a little too philosophical, but it's true. It is how the Abhisamayalankara actually presents it. But you have to understand what the 16 aspects of Four Noble Truths are before you can think of how they're empty. Just that would be time for one question or two at the most. But does anybody have a comment or a question if you want? Robin.
I guess 2 classes ago, or maybe it was the last class, you were talking about the tenets briefly, and you were recounting what the different schools are there, uh, from gross to subtle understanding of emptiness. And you said your definition of the prasangika was that things lack this uncommon mode of existence. And that's the object of negation. And so you're just recounting that exactly. It's really super helpful because it's like we get to a point where we're not negating enough.
Yeah.
That there's this subtle, brief moment when something appears to us as inherently existent before we go into the process of, I think that's an aspect of it. And
Yeah,
so
I agree.
that's
I agree.
super helpful to think about, that you take it only so far with these 16 aspects, and then you have to like go into this uncommon mode, this very, very subtle, mere aspect of phenomena. It's not even just self, it's phenomena. We just don't negate enough. And, the reason why I catch myself continually going back to the idea of Buddha nature, the very subtle mind and wind that carries this mind. I always think of it as, because it's permanent. Maybe it's just language, but of course it's my mind, that there's this permanence to it, just like the permanence of cessation that I immediately think translates to inherent.
Mm.
And how to refute that in our minds, that this subtle conveyance of this subtle continuum is also empty. And that would be helpful to me if I could figure that one out, or like really have a firm sense of its, because when something is permanent, it seems like I immediately assign it inherence, but that's not true. Permanent cessation, it, it's permanent. So it means that it lasts forever.
One point I'll just make, I don't know if it's helpful, but I'll just say it briefly, is I also think, I've always thought this, that I don't think there's a better term in English, but it's tricky in a way because the word, we say permanent, it's the English word we use, right? Like, I use it. I mean, I don't see a better one, but that according to Buddhist philosophy, but according to Buddhism, Buddhist philosophy, like, uh, actually permanent phenomena, um, it doesn't really have the same connotation, I guess, is one point. Or is takpa really in Tibet, right? Because may takpa is impermanent and takpa is permanent. it doesn't have the same connotation in Tibetan, I think, as in English, in the sense that in Buddhism, permanent phenomena are actually mere absences. So if you think about it, like there is, so and the examples they use are like unobstructed space. That's a mere absence of obstruction. A cessation, which is a mere absence of a mental affliction. Um, and so on. Like so, that so like when I think of like in English, when I think of permanent, actually, what comes to mind are impermanent phenomena. I think of like some kind of marble building or something that's actually impermanent and changes instant by instant. But actually, in Buddhism, what's permanent, actually, the only things that are permanent are absences, mere absences. Uh, and they're only, and really they're permanent because they don't function, because they're not functioning things that arose due to causes and conditions. They're mere absences. Emptiness is another, right? So emptiness is a mere absence of inherent existence. So it's an absence of something that never existed. So it'd be funny to say like, I mean, then it becomes kind of funny, right? That's always Chandrakirti talks about, or the Paramita talks about the emptiness of emptiness, in part because like there is the mere lack of a thing that never existed, and to say that somehow is inherently existent is seems quite fun, like.
You mean like, do you mean like as in cosmic joke?
Yeah, it's like, it'd be like, yeah, it becomes a pretty silly idea in a way. I mean, if you think about it deeply, it's like, yeah, like I'll say, like, I'll just give a some silly example for a second, like a fictional, like the fictional character from a novel in Japan doesn't exist in Japan. And that's a permanent phenomena because they were fictional to start with, right? Uh, whereas they never existed in the first place in Japan. So you can't say, it's not like they're like, then if I said, well, the absence of that fictional character in Japan is intrinsically existent, seems a little funny, doesn't it? It's like that is something like that anyway. But you get my point.
The definition helps immensely. It's
Yeah.
just another negation. It's a mere absence.
And that's
Yeah.
all permanent phenomenon. That's otherwise it's not it can't be permanent as long as so yeah, in Buddhism that's permanent means that, which I think is very tricky in a way. In English, just the word has a different connotation, but it helps to really think what's the definition or what's being gotten at or what are the examples. Because yeah, usually the examples are space, unobstructed space, emptiness of inherent existence, and mere cessations are the three. And they're all
Cessation.
absences.
Thank you so much. That this conversation really puts a lot more oomph into how far we have to go in terms of investigating emptiness, and it really makes the word mere feel almost alchemical. In the sense of it means so much. It has a tremendous amount of meaning, merely labeled or merely, you know. Anyway, thank you.
I think you're right. I guess we went over. We should stop it. And I'll just say we'll do the dedication in a second. And next class so that was we just want to at least you're going to see because the reason why I felt like we needed to cover the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths. One is it's an important teaching in Buddhism. The other is that a lot of the 37 aspects of enlightenment, some of them are focusing on the 16 aspects of it. So I was like, how do you talk about the 37 aspects of enlightenment, some of which are where you're focused, it'll say what you're focusing on is the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths. But if you don't know what those are, then how do you know what you're focusing on? So at least now we covered those in a kind of straightforward, basic way. So that now we'll switch our focus starting next class to the 37 harmonies. That's what right term. 37 harmonies with enlightenment. And the first four of those will be the four foundations of mindfulness. And so I guess I should just say too, some of you like to read, and so I'm going to continue for now mostly using the text by Emily Sue that was sent around. And so there's a section in there on the 4 foundations of mindfulness, and if you want to read it, you can read that part. Yeah, and the 4 close placements of mindfulness, which is on like around page 62 through 60 something. There's a very short, actually. Oh, it's just page 62, 63. I'm sure there's more in here about it, and there's a whole section on it in the Dalai Lama's book, which Thupten Chodron, Following in the Buddha's Footsteps, I think it's called. Yeah, Following in the Buddha. Then I'm also going to use that. So if people are interested, those will be the sources. But we'll look next class we'll start on the 4 foundations of mindfulness.
Could you say which book it was that you were making reference to by the couple about their experience with His Holiness?
Oh, it's not published yet. It's not that one. They were asking me to like look it over, but it's not published yet. So if it comes out, I'll tell you. Yeah, I'm sure it should come out. It was published in Tibetan, but they did an English she did an English translation, and that's not published yet.
Oh.
But okay, we should do the dedication. So the supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you, the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. And I dedicate all these merits, which are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side, so the I, who is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side, may achieve Buddha's enlightenment, which is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side, nor lead all sentient beings who are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side, to the state of enlightenment as quickly as possible. Also, dedicate, may the unmistaken reincarnation of Lama Zopa Rinpoche be found soon and benefit all beings. And then the last is, may all of us through this contemplation be able to, first through analysis and then directly come to actually understand the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths. May we come to experience them, to understand them, first conceptually and then directly, and thereby progress to liberation and help others progress to liberation as well. Thanks very much, everyone. And I guess, this class had to be online because of the internet problem at the center. So next class should be able to be hybrid for those who are local. I think so. At least there was some kind of problem that came to me that was happening there. But I think next time, and the next few classes are already online. So we'll just, the dates are there on the website. So we're good. So see you soon.
Thanks, Lauren.
Thanks, Lauren.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.